Most people think dopamine is what you get after achieving something. But in reality, the most powerful dopamine spikes don't come from rewards, they come from pursuit. It's not about what you have, it's about what you're chasing. Think of dopamine like a savings account. Every time you choose to engage in hard effort with focus, not for the outcome, but for the process, you're investing dopamine in long-term motivation. You're building a brain that craves challenge, not comfort. Dopamine is often misunderstood. Most people associate it purely with pleasure, the chemical that lights up your brain when you eat chocolate, scroll through social media, or achieve a goal. But the truth is more nuanced and, frankly, more empowering. Dopamine is not just the molecule of pleasure, it is the molecule of pursuit. It plays a central role in how we initiate and sustain effort, how we stay engaged in long-term goals, and how we stay motivated in the face of obstacles. To understand dopamine as a driver of pursuit, we need to look at how it works in the brain. Dopamine is released in several brain areas, but one of the most critical is a pathway called the mesolimbic pathway. This system connects regions of the brain involved in decision-making, movement, and reward anticipation. What's key here is the idea of anticipation. Dopamine doesn't just spike when you achieve something, it ramps up as you're moving toward that goal. In fact, some of the highest dopamine levels occur before the reward is received. This means your brain is most motivated not when it gets the reward, but when it expects it, when it's in motion, when it's chasing. This insight has powerful implications for how we approach motivation in our daily lives. If you believe dopamine is only about the reward, you'll constantly chase external outcomes. In terms of emotion's biggest change, it's about how you feel. You'll work hard only to get the trophy, the money, the recognition. But if you understand that dopamine is about pursuit, you can reframe effort itself as the source of motivation. You can start to value the grind, the repetitions, the quiet hours of focused work, because that's where dopamine is actively shaping your brain and behavior. What makes this even more fascinating is that dopamine is not just a passive signal. It actually teaches your brain what to want. Through a process called reward prediction error, your brain constantly updates its expectations based on how much dopamine is released in different scenarios. If your dopamine spikes during the process of writing, training, or learning, not just at the finish line, your brain begins to crave the work itself. It starts to associate progress, not just success, with a chemical sense of satisfaction. This is also why certain habits and behaviors can hijack the dopamine system. Like scrolling endlessly on your phone or binge watching shows floods your brain with dopamine without requiring any effort. Over time, this can reduce your sensitivity to natural dopamine rewards. When you finally sit down to do real, effortful work, it feels dull and unrewarding by comparison. That's not a willpower problem, it's a dopamine imbalance. You've conditioned your brain to associate pleasure with ease, not with pursuit. The good news is that the system is flexible. You can recalibrate your brain's dopamine response through intentional practice. By consistently linking dopamine to effort, pausing after a hard workout or a focused study session, and mentally rewarding yourself for the process, you reinforce the neural circuits that connect motivation with challenge. You become the kind of person who doesn't wait to feel inspired. You feel inspired because you're acting, you're in motion, and your dopamine is right there with you. Understanding dopamine as the fuel for pursuit rather than the prize for success shifts the entire framework of motivation. It allows you to find energy in motion, not just in achievement. This turns discipline into a feedback loop, one where effort becomes its own reward. And in that state, motivation becomes a renewable resource, one that you don't have to search for, you simply activate it by doing. True motivation doesn't come from hype, pressure, or the promise of rewards. It comes from something much deeper and more sustainable, the ability to genuinely enjoy the process itself. This is one of the most important psychological shifts a person can make. When motivation is tied solely to the outcome, it becomes fragile. It fades when the result doesn't come quickly enough or when progress stalls. But when you find ways to engage with the process, to connect with the act of doing, motivation becomes something you can generate internally, regardless of external circumstances. The reason many people struggle to stay consistent in their goals is because they view the work as a means to an end. Whether it's fitness, learning a new skill, building a career, or creating something meaningful, The process is often framed as a temporary grind. The thinking is, once I get there, it will all be worth it. But this mindset makes the journey feel like suffering, and it sets up a dependency on results that you can't always control. When you only feel good once you've hit the target, your motivation becomes conditional, and that's a dangerous place to be. Enjoying the process doesn't mean pretending everything is easy or fun. It means developing a relationship with effort that is rooted in curiosity, presence, and growth. When you start to observe your own progress, even small progress, and feel a sense of pride or interest in how you're changing, you begin to reinforce a cycle of internal reward. Your brain starts to link dopamine, the key neuromodulator for motivation, with the act of engaging rather than the outcome of succeeding. Over time, this creates a powerful shift. You begin to crave the work, not just the results. This mindset also frees you from the perfectionism that often paralyzes progress. When you're focused only on results, every mistake feels like failure. But when you care about the process, you start to see mistakes as part of the system, feedback, not judgment. You're more likely to try again, to refine, to experiment. That resilience is what fuels long-term motivation. It's not about always feeling excited. It's about being willing to return to the work again and again, even when it's hard, because something inside you has learned to value the act of doing. There's also a deep satisfaction that comes from engaging fully in the present moment. When you immerse yourself in the process, whether it's writing, coding, training, teaching, or learning, you enter a mental state often described as flow. In that state, time distorts, self-doubt quiets down, and you feel deeply connected to what you're doing. That feeling isn't dependent on external applause or final results. It's available every time you commit to the task with full attention. And that experience is what many people are really chasing, even if they don't know it. If motivation is always tied to the finish line, you'll spend most of your time dissatisfied, because most of life is spent in the middle of the race. But if you find ways to respect and even enjoy the training, the learning curve, the repetition, and the quiet steps that no one sees, then you tap into a source of energy that doesn't need to be chased. It's already there, waiting to be activated every time you choose to lean into the process. Over time, that internal drive becomes stronger than the temporary high of rewards, and you no longer have to force motivation. You've built it into the way you live. In the modern world, we're surrounded by an endless stream of easy dopamine hits. Social media likes, fast food, binge-watching shows, online shopping, and endless scrolling. These quick, low-effort rewards trigger temporary spikes of dopamine in the brain, giving us a fleeting sense of pleasure and satisfaction. But while these moments may feel good in the short term, they come at a cost. When we constantly rely on these forms of instant gratification, we begin to train our brains to expect dopamine with minimal effort, and this has a profound impact on our ability to stay motivated in more meaningful long-term pursuits. Dopamine is not just a feel-good molecule. It's a chemical that drives behavior. It plays a key role in motivation, goal setting, and reward seeking. When we receive dopamine in the right context, for example, after sustained effort, learning, or overcoming a challenge, it helps reinforce behaviors that lead to growth and resilience. But when we flood the brain with high levels of dopamine from artificial or effortless sources, we change the sensitivity of our reward system. The brain begins to adapt. It lowers its baseline, meaning we start needing more stimulation just to feel normal, and real-life activities that require patience and effort start to feel dull or even unbearable by comparison. This is why something as simple as sitting down to read a book, study, or work on a project can suddenly feel exhausting after hours of social media or gaming. Your brain has been trained to expect frequent, fast dopamine spikes. When those aren't present, the effortful activities that once brought satisfaction now feel flat and unrewarding. You're not lazy. Your dopamine system has been hijacked. The constant overstimulation from short-term dopamine hits rewires motivation pathways, making it harder to sustain focus, delay gratification, and engage deeply with challenging tasks. It's not just about attention spans. It's about how our brains learn to assign value. If every time you feel a little discomfort, you reach for your phone, a snack, or a distraction, you teach your brain that escape equals reward. That creates a cycle. Discomfort leads to avoidance. Avoidance leads to short-term pleasure, and short-term pleasure weakens your tolerance for long-term effort. Over time, this builds a brain that avoids challenge, and without challenge, there is no meaningful progress, no mastery, no purpose-driven achievement. Ironically, the very tools we use to feel better in the moment end up making us feel worse over time. After a binge of easy dopamine, people often report feeling drained, anxious, or even depressed. That's because the brain has to recover from the artificial high. The crash isn't just emotional, it's biochemical. And during that low, the motivation to do something hard or valuable drops even further. You want another hit just to feel okay again. This is the same neurological loop that makes addictive behavior so hard to break. However, the system is not broken, it's just been misused. Dopamine is flexible. The same brain that adapts to junk stimulation can also rewire itself to find joy and motivation in deeper, slower rewards. The key is to reduce reliance on constant hits and start reintroducing effort-based activities, exercise, learning, focused work, even if they feel unrewarding at first. By doing this consistently, you begin to restore the brain's ability to link dopamine with progress and effort, not just with instant pleasure. Understanding the trade-off between short-term dopamine hits and long-term motivation is essential for building a life driven by purpose, not just distraction. When you stop chasing easy rewards and start investing your attention in effortful actions, your brain begins to recalibrate. Over time, you no longer need to be constantly entertained because the work itself becomes meaningful and motivation becomes something you can build from within. Dopamine is often seen as something that happens to us, a chemical response to external rewards or pleasurable experiences. But one of the most powerful aspects of dopamine is that it's trainable. You can actually condition your brain to release dopamine in response to effort rather than just the outcome or the reward. This shift can change everything about how you stay motivated, pursue goals, and engage with challenges. It means you're no longer dependent on the finish line to feel good. You start to feel good simply by moving forward, even when the task is difficult. The way this works comes down to how dopamine interacts with your perception. The brain doesn't just release dopamine when something good happens, it releases it when it expects something good to happen. That means it's heavily influenced by context, attitude, and learned associations. If you mentally reward yourself during or after difficult effort, even in small, subtle ways, your brain begins to link that effort with dopamine. Over time, it starts to anticipate pleasure, not from the reward itself, but from the work it takes to get there. One of the most effective ways to do this is by consciously acknowledging your effort. After a focused work session, a workout, or a disciplined choice, take a few seconds to reflect and say to yourself, "That was hard, and I did it anyway." That small moment of internal recognition starts to create a neurological association between effort and a feeling of satisfaction. It might feel forced at first, especially if you're used to thinking that only results matter, but the brain adapts. If you keep repeating this process, it becomes automatic. Your brain starts releasing dopamine during effort, making the work feel more worthwhile. Another way to strengthen this link is to intentionally delay the reward. Instead of treating the reward as the source of pleasure, treat it as a marker of your discipline. For example, don't eat the chocolate because you finished the workout. Enjoy the workout because you're training your brain to feel good through exertion. The reward becomes symbolic, not chemical. This subtle shift teaches your brain that the process is what matters, not just the prize. It makes you more resilient because even if the reward is delayed, smaller than expected, or doesn't come at all, you still feel good about showing up and doing the work. This principle is particularly powerful because it helps you avoid the crash that often follows instant gratification. When you rely on external rewards or passive pleasure for dopamine, like scrolling, snacking, or distractions, your brain becomes used to a fast, easy high. But when dopamine is tied to effort, the release is slower, more stable, and much more sustainable. It builds a foundation for long-term motivation, where the act of doing is intrinsically rewarding. You start to crave challenge, not comfort. You become the kind of person who wants to push through resistance because you've trained your brain to find reward in the push itself. It's also worth noting that this kind of dopamine training supports other mental systems like focus, grit, and emotional regulation. When you associate effort with a positive outcome internally, you're less likely to be discouraged by setbacks. You don't fall apart when things get hard because the difficulty is no longer a threat, It's part of the reward. This builds a loop of feedback where each effort reinforces your identity as someone who keeps going. That identity then fuels more effort, and the cycle continues. Training your brain to associate dopamine with effort isn't about tricking yourself into liking hard things. It's about aligning your chemistry with your goals. By repeatedly pairing effort with internal reward, you reshape your motivational landscape. Over time, you stop needing external validation to move forward. The effort becomes its own motivation, and that is where lasting drive comes from. The brain is remarkably adaptable. Through a process called neuroplasticity, it can be rewired based on repeated experiences, behaviors, and even thoughts. One of the most powerful ways to harness this adaptability is through deliberate, effort-based action. When you consistently choose to take on challenging tasks and remain mentally engaged during those efforts, your brain starts to change. It begins to expect effort. It starts to associate challenge not with pain or stress, but with progress and potential reward. Over time, this rewiring can cause you to actually crave challenge, not just tolerate it, but actively seek it out as something meaningful and even enjoyable. This shift doesn't happen overnight. Most people initially avoid hard things because the brain naturally prefers efficiency and ease. When faced with a decision between comfort and effort, we tend to choose the path of least resistance, not because we're weak, but because our brains are wired to conserve energy. But that wiring is flexible. Each time you make a different choice, when you decide to go for a run instead of staying on the couch, to study instead of scrolling, or to tackle a difficult task rather than delay it, you are sending a signal to your brain. You are telling it this matters. This effort has value. That repeated message over time begins to reshape your neural pathways. Effort-based action is especially powerful when it is done deliberately. This means not just going through the motions, but engaging with full attention and intent. When you approach effort with awareness, when you're mentally present and actively working through discomfort, your brain encodes that experience differently. It doesn't just remember the outcome, it remembers the process. That memory, combined with the release of dopamine during and after the effort, begins to reinforce a positive association with challenge. The more you do this, the more your brain begins to expect reward from doing hard things, not just from achieving easy wins. This is how habits of discipline and resilience are built. It's not a personality trait, it's a practice. Each repetition strengthens the connection between effort and reward. You start to get small hits of satisfaction, not just when you finish a task, but while you're immersed in it. That's when the real shift happens. You begin to feel pulled toward challenges because they offer something that easy tasks don't: a sense of growth, a rush of engagement, and a deeper kind of reward that comes from knowing you are changing in the process. This craving for challenge isn't about seeking struggle for the sake of struggle. It's about recognizing that hard things often carry the most meaning. When your brain starts to associate difficulty with development, you stop fearing the discomfort that comes with growth. You stop avoiding the friction. Instead, you begin to feel a sense of opportunity in that resistance. It becomes a signal that you're on the right path, not a reason to turn back. What's even more interesting is that this rewiring has a compounding effect. The more challenges you take on and complete, the more confidence you build in your ability to handle future ones. That confidence isn't false optimism. It's built from evidence, real, lived experience of overcoming. And that evidence changes your identity. You no longer see yourself as someone who dreads hard things. You see yourself as someone who rises to them. The craving for challenge becomes internalized, and motivation stops being something you wait for. It becomes something you generate through action, one deliberate effort at a time. Dopamine can be thought of as more than just a brain chemical. It functions like a motivational investment account. Just like a financial account, it has deposits and withdrawals. How you manage those inputs determines your future energy, focus, and drive. When you consistently invest dopamine into the right places, effort, learning, persistence, you build a system that works for you. You create a foundation of internal motivation that doesn't rely on external triggers. But when you spend dopamine recklessly on short-term pleasures and distractions, you deplete the system, leaving yourself with less energy and less drive to face the challenges that actually matter. Every time you choose to focus, work hard, or resist the urge to take the easy route, you make a dopamine deposit. These moments of deliberate effort may not feel immediately rewarding, but they build the structure of long-term motivation. Your brain learns to associate satisfaction with discipline, not just with outcomes. That wiring matters because most meaningful pursuits, whether personal, professional, or creative, require consistent energy over long periods. Without steady deposits, you can't expect to draw motivation when you need it most. On the other hand, every time you give in to quick dopamine spikes through activities that require little to no effort, scrolling endlessly on social media, eating ultra-processed snacks, jumping from one digital stimulation to the next, you're making a withdrawal. These moments feel good temporarily, but they drain your reserves. They create a pattern where your brain becomes used to high stimulation without any real effort. Over time, this makes natural sources of motivation, like learning, working toward goals, or engaging in deep focus, feel bland or boring by comparison. Your brain essentially learns that only instant gratification is worth attention, and the account begins to run low. The way you manage this balance influences the way you feel day to day. A well-regulated dopamine system provides clarity, momentum, and a sense of purpose. You're more likely to seek out challenges, stick with them, and feel emotionally rewarded along the way. A depleted system, however, leaves you scattered and unmotivated. Tasks that once brought satisfaction feel dull, and your ability to push through difficulty is weakened. This isn't just psychological, it's neurological. Dopamine shapes what your brain perceives as rewarding, and your daily actions teach it where to expect those rewards. Building a positive dopamine investment strategy starts with awareness. When you notice yourself constantly seeking stimulation, pause and assess. Is this a deposit or a withdrawal? Is it building long-term motivation or just relieving boredom? The answer isn't to eliminate all pleasure or comfort. Rather, it's to be selective about what you reward. When you celebrate the process, acknowledging effort, progress, or simply showing up, you're making a deposit. That reinforcement helps your brain connect hard work with emotional satisfaction, strengthening your motivational system over time. Just like in financial investing, compounding is the secret. One day of effort may not feel life-changing, but repeated consistently, those small actions build into something powerful. Each focused hour, each difficult task you face, each time you choose the harder path when it matters, they all contribute to a growing account of internal motivation. And from that account, you can draw when things get tough, when your goals stretch out far into the distance, or when success feels uncertain. By treating dopamine like a resource to manage, rather than something that simply happens, you gain control over how you engage with your life. You stop chasing temporary highs and start building a durable source of energy. Over time, your habits shape your brain to value what truly moves you forward, not just what feels good in the moment. And that kind of motivation doesn't burn out. It builds.